It's the war that no European leader wants, and the war that every European leader feels is brewing on the horizon. Year after year, intelligence leaders and defense experts grow increasingly certain that a test from Moscow is coming, a direct challenge to NATO principles of collective defense and an open play for power. But now, affairs across the Atlantic have forced NATO leaders to reckon with another grim prospect, that if Russia's challenge does come within the next few years, then the most powerful member of the NATO alliance may not even lift a finger to respond. Take the United States out of the equation, and the nations of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization are forced to answer the ultimate question: can they stand up to Moscow? On land, at sea, in the air, and on the home front, NATO must find a way to resist Russian aggression. If they fail, then Russia's probing test won't be the only attack that's coming, and if Vladimir Putin has his way, the entire continental order in post-Soviet Europe may come crumbling down. Now, before we dive into today's question, we've got to establish some terms of engagement. Today, we'll be comparing the military arsenals of NATO, minus the United States, against that of Russia. And that means that non-European NATO members, particularly Canada, will be included in this analysis, while non-NATO European nations like Switzerland or Serbia will not. We also won't be counting Ukraine towards Europe's advantages, either as a military partner or as a territory where some of the fighting could take place away from both Russia and NATO soil. Today, we'll stay away from the geopolitical side of things for the most part. And finally, we're going to hold off on discussions of a nuclear exchange, where Russia, in a confrontation where America's nuclear umbrella doesn't apply, would be at a clear and undisputable advantage. We certainly wouldn't like to think that Britain and France's combined several hundred warheads would make for some deterrent value, but either they do deter Russia and we get a conventional war, or they don't, and everybody's gonna get blown up anyway. Instead, we're gonna focus on the conventional warfare assets on both sides of this hypothetical conflict, and we'll start with a look at their land forces. Take the United States out of the NATO alliance, and its remaining nations can still field about 2.2 million active duty military personnel going by 2024 numbers. Those numbers don't account for another 2.5 million reservists or nearly 1 million additional paramilitary forces under the control of nations like Turkey, France, and Italy. Those same nations are among those who supply the highest proportion of NATO's military personnel, along with the UK, Germany, Poland, Greece, and Spain, each fielding well over 100,000 troops, and Romania and Canada, each with over 70,000. Of those 2.2 million active duty troops, a majority are part of the various armies, ground forces, and at times amphibious marine units of their home nations. Taking a rather conservative estimate, we'll place the number of dedicated ground troops in the NATO alliance, again without the United States, at 1.3 million before discussing reservists. When it comes to heavy armor, and particularly main battle tanks, NATO can call quite a bit of equipment to bear. Among the main battle tanks at NATO's disposal are thousands of German-made Leopard and Leopard 2 tanks, with the Leopard 2 in particular forming the backbone of most standing European armies. The Leopard 2 is widely regarded as a world-class tank, and by the numbers, it's the most popular tank in the world. Although these tanks aren't impervious to destruction during battle, as proved via its utilization by Ukraine, no tank is a perfect solution to the problems of modern warfare. And of all the options in the world, the Leopard 2 is a pretty strong choice. In NATO arsenals, the Leopard series is joined by several hundred Leclerc tanks produced by France, several hundred Challenger 2 and 3 tanks produced by Britain, and several hundred Ariete tanks produced by Italy. The American M1 Abrams, the South Korean K2 Black Panther, the Romanian TR-85, the Swedish-German Stridsvagn, and the Polish Twary aren't uncommon either. They're backed by hundreds upon hundreds of older model tanks, mostly sourced from the US, and a smaller proportion of old Soviet-era stock like the T-55. In all, NATO's modern tank arsenal comes in at a bit under 2,000, joined by several thousand other tanks that are less prepared for today's battlefields. And then there's the question of artillery, where several NATO nations can offer modern hardware for modern battlefields. In terms of towed and self-propelled shelling artillery, more advanced kit includes dozens to hundreds of copies each of the following: the highly effective French Caesar system, the Turkish Fatina, the British AS-90, the Swedish Archer, the German PZH-2000, the Spanish Santa Barbara Sistemas, the South Korean-made K9 Thunder, and modernized versions of the American M109. Mobile rocket launchers are equally important, with the American-made multiple launch rocket system and HIMARS, the Korean-made K239 Chunmoo, the Turkish TR-107 and T-122, and the Czech RM-70, all worthy of mention. Many of these same NATO nations field a range of ballistic missiles, including the proven American-made ATACMS, while effective missile defense systems, including numerous Patriot missile batteries, are spread across the continent. All that, of course, is accompanied by many thousands of older towed and self-propelled artillery pieces, including World War II-era American stock like the M101 and the M114. After all, the basic principles of point big gun toward enemy have not really changed much since 1941. Specialized tank destroyers are also a relatively common fixture, especially in Italy, where some 400 Centauro and Centauro 2 platforms are dedicated fully to the task. And of course, infantry fighting vehicles, mine-resistant trucks, and armored personnel carriers are all accessible in considerably high numbers, as they're far easier to procure at large scale. Beyond sheer numbers of troops and equipment, European militaries share a range of notable strengths, while individual nations excel in certain areas that deserve mention. By and large, NATO armies are noted for their professionalism and quality of training, and typically they'll stress quality of troops, equipment, tactics, and more instead of opting for sheer volume of either kit or lives. Many NATO member nations are well accustomed to rapid deployments abroad. Some of them boast quite formidable special operations units, and their interoperable NATO standard equipment, as well as their unified command and control structure through the alliance, are invaluable assets at their disposal. Several NATO member nations, and especially Finland, are elite in Arctic environments, while others, including the British, the French, and more, are used to operating all across the world. Many NATO militaries hold the trust of their people in crisis situations, and many, especially those closest to Russia like the Baltic states, Finland, and Poland, are exceptionally motivated to fight to the last and prevent Russian victory. But let's talk about Russia, where we've got to issue another quick caveat. As we would hope that any viewers of a channel focusing on modern conflicts would know, Russia currently at war with Ukraine, and that war has been responsible for the loss of large but as yet undetermined amounts of Russian troops and military equipment. As a result, we'll be working with estimates when discussing what Russia has in its arsenal, not hard figures, but with any luck, we'll be at least in striking distance. The Russian military in peacetime stands at an overall strength of 1.5 million active servicemen after numbers were adjusted in September 2024 by Vladimir Putin. At that size, once its ranks are filled after the war, Russia will control the world's second largest active military, along with several 100,000 auxiliary forces, bringing the nation to a total military strength of 2.38 million. The nation counts an additional 2 million reservists, although the degree to which those reservists have remained in reserve is hazy in a practical sense. It's unclear whether those numbers account for Russian paramilitary troops, particularly the former Wagner Group fighters, now made subsidiary to the Russian Ministry of Defense. But if those groups are not accounted for, then they'll raise the number of troops at Russia's disposal by a couple of tens of thousands in aggregate. Right now, external estimates suggest that Russia has about 500,000 ground troops at its disposal, although Moscow's true battlefield losses, like Ukraine's, are a closely guarded secret over the course of the current conflict. Now, assuming that Russia has the time to rebuild in peace, we'll take it at its full projected military strength of 1.5 million active duty troops, and we'll estimate that 700,000 to 800,000 of those troops will be a part of the Russian ground forces. At the time of writing, the amount of equipment at the Russian ground forces' disposal is believed to be somewhat diminished. Russia was estimated in early 2024 to have lost over 3,000 tanks in Ukraine, equivalent to all of its active tank inventory before the war, and estimates from late in 2024 suggested that Russia's shortage had become truly critical at loss rates of some 20 tanks a day. As a result, the modern tanks that once filled Russia's arsenal, particularly the T-90, are no longer available, and they're being replenished at rates that seem to be around 70 units per year. The tanks that have replaced them, older model T-72s, T-62s, and even the 1940s era T-54 and T-55, are also being destroyed at high rates. But assuming that a peace deal has either gone into effect by the time this episode comes out or would be hypothetically forthcoming tomorrow, we can at least make some projections. Drawing on those older or obsolete tanks that haven't yet been sent to the front, Russia may still be able to refurbish and prepare a couple of thousand for active combat. That's according to the Kyiv Independent, which estimated in January 2025 that Russia has about 2,000 tanks left to send toward the front. Meanwhile, with Russia's economy expected to remain on its war footing for quite a while, we can assume that T-90 production may ramp up over a couple of years of peacetime. Being generous, let's assume that Russia can double its T-90 production capacity for 5 years, giving it a total of 700 in its arsenal by 2030, backed up by those 2,000 older models. When it comes to armored personnel carriers, tank destroyers, infantry fighting vehicles, and more, Russia appears to be in a similar spot. That same Kyiv Independent estimate that we mentioned earlier suggests that Russia probably has about 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles and 3,000 armored personnel carriers. That article also points out that Russia is having trouble producing enough heavy equipment to make up the shortfalls that it's facing, and while we'll be generous when estimating that Russia can surge its production capacity to build 700 modern tanks, well, that generosity is going to have to come out from someplace else. Considering that Russia's specific shortfalls of modern kit aren't quite as severe for its other armored vehicles, we'll assume those numbers are replenished much slower. And just as the situation is getting worse for Russian armored vehicles, it's getting worse for Russian artillery, which Western sources suggest may be suffering rapid losses by way of Ukrainian drone attacks. For viewers who are more familiar with Russian artillery, we're not discussing shell expenditure rates here. We'll cover that in a later section. Instead, we're talking about the actual artillery pieces. Russia is believed to have had over 19,000 artillery pieces prior to the war, just counting those that could be observed in open-air storage via satellite imagery. But as of early 2025, those stocks have been severely depleted, especially the self-propelled howitzers that Russia initially relied on. In particular, Russia's reserve of barrels for its artillery is believed to have run nearly dry. The exact numbers that Russia still has are difficult to pinpoint, but it's thought to have low numbers of self-propelled artillery alongside probably several thousand towed artillery pieces. These problems are made all the more acute when accounting for the traditional strengths of the Russian ground forces. The Russian military operates with a very specific sort of approach, favoring grinding, attritional warfare that's usually, if not always, decided by Russia's ability to expend relative to its enemies. Under ideal conditions, Russian troops are decently well trained, but their ability to provide a large mass of troops in a combat situation is just as important, if not more so, than each of those troops' abilities in a fight. So too, with tanks or artillery, Russian forces aspire to draw adversaries into battles where ammunition is launched and burned through at high rates and where very little is off-limits to destroy. Russian forces are notorious, for example, for their practices in urban combat, preferring to level a city block and then move troops through the rubble rather than clearing the city block one building at a time. But that sort of tactical approach requires Russia to maintain advantages in artillery, heavy armored vehicles, and personnel, and while some of its shortfalls, particularly in personnel, can be fixed through conscription and training, its equipment losses will be more difficult to bounce back from. When making a direct comparison between the land forces of Russia and of NATO, we find something of a mixed bag here. The very best of NATO's equipment is quite simply superior to Russian kit. Just see the performance of weapons like Caesar artillery or Western tanks. But their technical superiority doesn't mean that they're immune from destruction. Again, just see the performance of Western tanks, with a high proportion of those tanks known to have been destroyed. On personnel, NATO is a fair match for Russia in terms of numbers, and its professional militaries certainly outperform Russia's current batch of conscripts, while on equipment, NATO's current arsenals have a clear advantage over depleted Russian stock. But give Russia a few years to rearm, replenish what heavy equipment it can, and assemble a better trained ground force, and the balance swings back to equal. Russia's expected long-term reliance on older tanks, fighting vehicles, and towed artillery still set it back. But NATO's set back too, hamstrung by logistical challenges that we'll deal with later and forced into a situation where it's got to play Russia's game. The trouble with fighting against a military that uses Russian-style tactics is that, as Ukraine has learned, Russia is really good at forcing its adversaries to fight Russia's kind of fight. Faced with the problem of grinding attrition, NATO will have to answer either via grinding attrition or by leveraging some massively game-changing capabilities that prevent Russia from fighting its preferred fight. Perhaps that game-changing capability will come in another chapter, but on the ground, NATO just doesn't have it. It can't overrun Russia through sheer numbers. Its technology isn't so good that it could just shut down Russian equipment, and although NATO would likely copy Ukraine-style drone warfare tactics, so would Russia. If NATO tanks and artillery enter that grinding battle against Russia, then their equipment is superior and their personnel are superior, at least for now. That approach only works when you've got either the artillery shells and tank rounds to keep it going, or you can turn the tables in another way. Next up, we'll turn to the question of air combat, where, at least in terms of its fighter aircraft, the nations of NATO have quite a bit of kit to be proud of. We'll break this section down into three component parts: tip-of-the-spear aircraft, other combat aircraft, and non-combat support capabilities. When it comes to NATO's tip-of-the-spear air power, we've got to start with the Lockheed Martin F-35. Between NATO member air forces and a select few navies, the F-35 is common throughout the alliance and becoming even more widespread. Within a few years, European nations will have hundreds. 138 to the United Kingdom, 95 to Italy, 88 for Canada, 64 each for Finland and Poland, 50 to the Netherlands, and between 25 and 49 each for Norway, Romania, Denmark, Belgium, Greece, Germany, and the Czech Republic. Current totals are a good deal lower than that, with the F-35 still in production, but even still, the addition of a mere 1 to 200 fifth-generation stealth aircraft is already a major advantage. Joining the F-35 at the tip of the spear is the French Rafale, with nearly 200 currently in NATO hands, and with France alone expected to field about 225 copies of the plane's most modern iteration. We've also got to account for the Eurofighter Typhoon, with nearly 500 of the jets in European arsenals via the UK, Germany, Italy, Spain and Austria. That trio of aircraft are what we'd consider to be Europe's Big Three, joined by an anticipated 60 Swedish copies of the latest model Saab Gripen, the E/F variants. Flying back up to support those aircraft are a wide range of other combat-capable jets hailing from all across the world. One particularly common fixture is the F-16, with modern upgrades like the F-16V and other late block models debatable as being on par with the aircraft we've placed at the tip of the spear. France and Greece combined to field several dozen copies of the Mirage 2000 multi-role fighter, while the aging Panavia Tornado, also a multi-role aircraft, flies in the air forces of Germany and Italy. Old Soviet kit is common in some nations, including Poland, where a handful of MiG-29 and Su-22 aircraft fly alongside an expected 69 copies of South Korea's light multi-role fighter, the Golden Eagle. America's F/A-18 Hornet is common, with hundreds of Hornets in service with Finland, Canada and Spain. About 100 copies of older model Swedish Gripens still fly at varying levels of upgrade, while Portugal will soon fly a couple of dozen of Brazil's famed prop-powered attack planes, the A-29 Super Tucano. A couple of nations, particularly Turkey and Greece, even fly vintage F-4 Phantoms, with Turkey having upgraded its remaining stocks to the rather badass-sounding Terminator Edition. Then there are all the non-combat aircraft in circulation across NATO member air forces, serving just as important a role as their armed counterparts, and at times even more important. When it comes to tactical and strategic airlift, Europe has a range of options at its disposal. The most popular is the Airbus A400M, the Atlas, with a total of 170 flown by Germany, France, Spain and other nations, once their orders are all delivered in the next few years. Excluding American planes, the Alliance flies about 50 C-130J Super Hercules airlifters plus dozens of older Hercules models. The CASA CN-235 is a popular choice, with over 100 in operation across the Alliance, plus 80-odd copies of its successor aircraft, the C-295. 16 copies of the C-17 Globemaster are at either NATO's disposal or the disposal of specific NATO nations, plus around 35 copies of the Italian-made C-27J Spartan. Finally, Brazil's C-390 Millennium is about to get very popular in Europe, with a total of 3 delivered so far, at a moment when export contracts are getting signed as fast as Brazil can draw them up. For air-to-air refueling, NATO nations will soon fly a total of about 60 Airbus multi-role tanker transports, military variants of the A330-200 airliner, plus over a dozen tanker versions of the Super Hercules, a handful of KC-135 Stratotanker aircraft, and 4 KC-767s in Italy's possession. For airborne early warning and control, the Alliance flies 18 E-3 Sentry aircraft, including 14 from NATO's Unified Air Wing, plus an anticipated 10 to 13 copies of the more modern E-7 Wedgetail, first cooked up for Australia. Sweden and Poland combined to fly 4 AEW&C copies of the Saab 340. Other notable aircraft include 3 Rivet Joint Reconnaissance aircraft in British service and 38 Poseidon maritime patrol planes. And finally, it's worth noting briefly that NATO nations also field a wide variety of combat and utility rotorcraft, as well as a growing range of unmanned drones, but we'll move past those assets quickly for the sake of time. With that, we turn again toward Russia, where numbers of equipment are, again, a little bit hazy, but where we can do a somewhat better job approximating what's available. That's partly because, after a few difficult early months, Russian aircraft have stayed well away from Ukrainian airspace, so their current inventory is believed to be closer to their pre-war arsenal, with a couple of exceptions that we'll point out. For the Russian Air Force, the tip of the spear, allegedly, is the Su-57 Felon. About 30 copies of the aircraft have now been produced, and according to Russia, it is a highly advanced 5th-generation fighter on par with America's F-35 or China's J-20 Mighty Dragon. That said, its actual capabilities are somewhat suspect, from evidence of shoddy workmanship that would substantially increase its radar return to doubts about its viability as a combat aircraft, since it's mostly stayed far away from Ukraine's front lines. Russia plans to build over 70 of the aircraft at present, and probably more after that. Backing those up in Russia's pre-war inventory are over 100 each of several derivatives of the Sukhoi Su-27. Those include the baseline Su-27 aircraft built to compete with America's F-14 and F-15, plus the all-weather air-to-air variant, the Su-30, the fighter-bomber heavy variant, the Su-34, and the most modern of the line, the air superiority-optimized Su-35. Also, among its combat aircraft are a small handful of MiG-35 jet fighters, purported to be very highly advanced upgrades of the MiG-29, and somewhere in the range of 1 to 200 standard MiG-29s as well. The Russian Air Force flies over 100 copies of the MiG-31 Interceptor, and pre-war it flew well over 200 each of the Su-24 and Su-25 ground attack aircraft. Those attack jets have been the subject of particularly nasty attrition rates since they come closest into contact with Ukrainian ground troops, and other jets that perform low-flying missions have also been liable to be shot down. In terms of its non-combat aircraft, Russia relies on a couple of hundred older Soviet-era airlifters to cover short tactical lifts, while relying on a little over 100 Ilyushin IL-76 aircraft and just 4 airworthy Antonov AN-124s to perform strategic airlift. The nation leverages airborne command and control capabilities through the Beriev A-50, although the war in Ukraine has done a number on the A-50 fleet, with as few as 2 or 3 qualified aircrews believed to be able to use them. The nation flies 20 modified IL-78 aircraft as air-to-air refueling tankers, plus a couple of command and control jets. Like NATO, Russia also has a lot of attack helicopters and small drones, although its helicopter fleet in particular has taken rather stunning losses on the battlefield. Finally, though, the Russian Air Force has a trick up its sleeve, and one that NATO just cannot match without America: strategic bombers. Between its aged Tu-95 turboprop aircraft, its newer Tu-22 swing-wing supersonic bomber, and its even more modern Tu-160, Russia is thought to fly somewhere over 100 strategic bombers, even though there's some haziness about just how large of a portion of Russia's fleet is currently flying. When comparing the two sides head-to-head, NATO comes away with a few clear advantages. Even if the Su-57 is exactly as formidable as Russia claims, and even if Russia can complete its full production order for over 70 before war breaks out, NATO would still hold a clear numeric advantage in stealth aircraft. More likely than not, it'll also have an edge in quality. The same can be said for NATO's tip-of-the-spear fighter aircraft. The Rafale, the Typhoon, and the advanced Gripen are all better optimized for modern air-to-air engagements than the Su-35 or the MiG-35, and again, those Russian aircraft are outnumbered. NATO's backbench of aircraft, so to speak, includes the late-model F-16s and modern Golden Eagles, still very impressive in combat and still at both a quality and quantity advantage over what Russia has in its arsenal. And not only that, but NATO holds clear advantages when it comes to air-to-air refueling, airborne battlefield command and tracking capabilities, and both tactical and strategic airlift. NATO-issue ordnance is, by and large, more effective for engagements with aerial targets, and NATO-issue air defense systems have proven very effective in destroying Russian aircraft over Ukraine. That being said, Russia does take home advantages in 2 areas: range and capacity for destruction. On the latter point, Russia has strategic bombers, and without the US, NATO doesn't. Plus, the fighter bomber Su-34 and its many attack aircraft granted additional capacity to drop ordnance that non-US NATO can't really match. Also, both Russia's strategic bombers and its fighter aircraft, particularly the Sukhoi line, are built for extended range operations, meaning that although Russia doesn't have comparable in-air refueling capabilities, it does have a lesser need for those services. Even still, NATO gets the nod in a battle of air forces, with a somewhat more decisive lead than either side was able to achieve on the ground. Now we'll move to the naval arena, where things are a bit more open and shut. In this instance, we're actually going to start with Russia, because having Russia as a comparison case puts NATO's maritime strength into perspective. At its disposal, Russia has just one working battlecruiser, the Pyotr Veliky, with a second expected to return to service in 2026. Right now, Russia sails just 2 guided missile cruisers, just 7 destroyers with 3 more kept away from deployment, just 11 frigates with 1 more under refit, 15 large landing ships, 9 ballistic missile subs in service out of 12 in its possession, 9 cruise missile subs out of a total of 12 in its possession, and precisely 6 nuclear attack submarines out of 13 in its possession. It's also technically in possession of an aircraft carrier, although it's mostly an ornamental piece that's occasionally passed around between different Russian dry docks. A handful of diesel attack subs, a few dozen corvettes, and a couple of hundred smaller support ships round out its navy, with many of those also undergoing repairs. Russia used to have a somewhat more formidable navy, but a fair bit of its inventory has been forcibly converted into submarines and now sits at the bottom of the Black Sea, courtesy of Ukraine. Russian ships that are taken out of service tend to take a very long time to return. Not only that, but Russia splits its ships between 4 fleets, one of which, the Pacific Fleet, is based too far away to be relevant in a contest with NATO, and another of which, the Northern Fleet, would have to fight its way out of the Arctic and possibly into the Mediterranean. On the other side of our proverbial cage match, NATO doesn't necessarily crush Russia in terms of volume, but it's fair to say that the alliance packs a bit more heat, even without the United States. To start, take the alliance's 6 working aircraft carriers, 2 each from the UK and Italy, 1 each from Spain and France. Operating at full capacity, Britain's Queen Elizabeth class will be able to carry up to 60 or more F-35s under battle conditions. France's will bring 30 Rafales, Spain's will bring up to 25 F-35s, and Italy's pair put together can bring up to 54 F-35s. That alone would hand NATO forces a major advantage in a straight-up maritime confrontation with Russia, but aircraft carriers, they don't travel alone. The bulk of NATO maritime capability comes from 4 navies: Britain, France, Spain, and Italy. They combine to offer 80 nuclear attack and ballistic missile submarines, a handful of diesel electrics, 20 destroyers, 40 frigates, 5 large amphibious assault ships, and ample other support ships to back them up. Elsewhere in the alliance, Turkey brings 11 attack subs, 17 frigates, and an amphibious assault ship. Sweden brings 5 attack submarines, Germany 6 plus 11 frigates, while Poland brings an attack sub and 2 more frigates. On the Black Sea, Romania can field 3 frigates and Bulgaria soon 6. NATO's got 2 subs and 5 frigates from Portugal, 10 subs and soon to be 17 frigates from Greece, 3 subs and 6 frigates from the Netherlands, 4 frigates and 6 subs from Norway, 9 frigates from Denmark, and 2 from the Netherlands. All told, that's 6 aircraft carriers, 20 destroyers, over 120 frigates, and over 60 submarines, nearly 20 of which are nuclear-powered. Compare that to the portion of Russia's navy that's actually seaworthy, and, well, NATO wins. Add to that NATO's greater ability to buy or start producing the kamikaze sea drones that Ukraine's used to such effect in the Black Sea, and NATO really wins. Enough said on that. Speaking of the ability to produce weapons, it's time that we graduate from the punching and kicking limbs of our 2 opposing sides and take a look at their respective backbones, their ability to sustain defense industrial production and meet the demands of war. There are 3 basic questions at hand here. How fast can each side produce? How fast can each side replenish? And what is the relative quality of things that each side can make on a tight timeline? For Russia, military production capacity is the cornerstone of the nation's approach to battle, although not in every area at once. As can be seen with Russia's naval fleet, the nation is not equipped to refurbish and quickly turn around warships that have been damaged or are in need of extensive maintenance. Nor are they able to produce highly complex fighting machines at high rates. Take the number of 70-odd T-90 tanks produced per year, or estimates per the International Institute for Strategic Studies that the Russian Air Force received only 18 homemade combat aircraft in 2023, not counting an unknown number of Su-57s. For contrast, the outlet Simple Flying indicates that Western nations, counting the US, can make about 260 fighter aircraft a year. The nation is estimated to produce just 50 artillery barrels a year at paces that it can't easily scale up, and only about 200 fighting infantry vehicles annually, while refurbishing only a couple of hundred tanks per year at best. Complex equipment is really not Russia's strength. Instead, the place that Russia truly excels is in making things that go boom, and especially artillery shells. According to NATO intelligence estimates from 2024, Russia was producing, at that time, about 3 million artillery shells a year, every year. For comparison, the US military, in an ideal world, would have produced 1.2 million shells that year and didn't even end up coming close. Around that same time, Russia was firing up to 10,000 artillery shells a day or more, definitely enough to blow through its own stocks, but not enough to blow through those stocks quickly. The reason why that production capacity really matters is because unless you've got extensive enough airborne or behind enemy line sabotage capability, the only way to slow down a creeping artillery barrage is with your own artillery firing back and posing a risk to the heavy guns on the opposite side. We've referenced Russia's very specific attritional style of warfare before, and this is where it really shows up. Fight an artillery war with Russia, and very quickly that war becomes about nothing but artillery. Thus, the fundamental wager at the heart of Russian military strategy is a simple one: that Russia can force its enemy to deplete its artillery ammunition before Russia finishes depleting its own. Elsewhere, Russia's military-industrial complex isn't in a great spot. Due to ongoing sanctions, it lacks many of the component parts to build engines, microelectronics, and more at scale, while it's faced increasing shortages in other areas. Not only that, but the war in Ukraine has helped to create yawning deficits in the amount of military hardware Russia has compared to what it needs. Its civilian workers do their jobs in harsh conditions, often lack technical education, and will frequently leave Russia to live and work elsewhere if they have the skill set to do so. That said, Russia has still proved that its military industry is resilient and can flex to accommodate shortages while importing from friendly nations, smuggling technology in when it can, and pivoting to a war economy to stretch out its economic potential for as long as it can. Sustainability is a major issue here. Put simply, Russia is making incredible short-term sacrifices today to avoid experiencing hardship till tomorrow. In a short window of peace, before a war with NATO, that means that Russia isn't likely to suddenly develop a new capacity to get its ships or damaged fighter jets working again without sacrificing other areas. But the core of that military-industrial complex, not in production of weapons but in ammunition, remains a force to be reckoned with. For the foreseeable future, Russia won't be excellent at building complex or advanced warfighting technologies, but sometimes wars still get decided by finding out who can shoot who, and Russia's got a lot of stuff to shoot. On the other side, NATO's defense industrial base, without the United States, has been a recent source of major anxiety or even outright panic. Imagine we're not sharing anything that you don't already know, but the US is practically heaven for defense contractors, and between that reality and America's enduring capacity to build weapons at scale, NATO has relied on American military-industrial might for decades. Now, recent geopolitical shifts are forcing NATO nations to ask what they can do without America, and indeed, that's the entire reason why we put this episode together. But nowhere is it tougher to answer that question than on the defense industrial side. And let's be clear, NATO nations do have some things going for them. Sprawling defense companies like Rheinmetall, BAE Systems, Airbus, and Leonardo are able to build fighting tools for land, air, and sea. Europe indigenously produces the Leopard series of tanks, the Eurofighter, Rafale, and Gripen jets, many of their own advanced munitions, and more. NATO nations host a wide range of startups and innovative companies that are more than capable of adapting to create high-tech warfighting equipment, from drones to cyber warfare tools to sensor kits to just about any other fancy tool that you could ask for. But thanks in large part to the war in Ukraine, NATO nations are being forced to reckon with the fact that these high-tech systems might not actually be what matters. Take the results of a large conference held by the Atlantic Council in late 2024, bringing together over 100 key defense industrial figures to chart a better path forward. Perhaps the biggest area of improvement was this one. Quoting the Atlantic Council directly, prioritizing both resilient supply chains and shifting toward a mass-first mindset, which means focusing on rapidly producing large quantities of essential military equipment to sustain prolonged operations, emphasizing quantity over high-tech features. Putting that a little more simply, NATO is in bad need of new capacity to produce overwhelming amounts of ammunition, artillery shells, expendable unmanned systems, and other systems that the alliance has quite frankly overlooked. Not only that, but NATO nations beyond the US will need to be able to build overlapping, redundant capabilities. It's not enough to just build one factory producing artillery shells, because in that situation, one well-placed Russian missile strike or one badly timed accidental fire could cripple the whole continent. The good news for NATO nations is that at this point, the alliance has largely recognized the problems in front of it. The bad news is that fixing those problems takes time. In order to build artillery shells, you've got to build factories. In order to build factories, you've got to build manufacturing equipment. And in order to do anything with that manufacturing equipment, you've got to construct a building and hire qualified personnel, and so on and so forth. Adding to this confusion, European defense manufacturers have tried time and time again to explain to continental leaders that simply asking to make more stuff isn't enough. Those manufacturers need orders. They need real investment. And right now, the nations of Europe just have not obliged. That might change soon, but it hasn't changed yet. On military-industrial matters, the advantage simply has to go to Russia, not because Russia can make better equipment than NATO nations, and not because it can make as versatile of a selection. It can't do either. What it can do is to mass-produce the small subset of basic, unglamorous equipment that wins wars when they are at their very toughest. Europe can reach parity with Russia. In fact, if Europe leveraged its capabilities to their full extent, Russia would have no hope of catching up. But again, that hasn't happened yet, and until it does, the advantage firmly with Russia. Finally, we'll run through all of the other intangibles that we've got to account for when looking at an all-out war between Russia and the non-US nations of NATO. We'll start with force readiness, where in Europe, NATO troops are considered to be at an enhanced state of readiness for battle. NATO has rapid deployment forces ready to go thanks to changes made as a result of the war in Ukraine. Undercutting that, however, are broader struggles across the NATO alliance. Many NATO nations, even the big ones, suffer from lower recruitment numbers than they'd like, fewer weapons or equipment ready to go than they'd want, and impressive capabilities hamstrung by logistical trouble. Take the UK's 2 aircraft carriers, both of which simply don't have enough aircraft right now to be useful in all-out combat. Meanwhile, we've gone through many of Russia's force readiness issues already. Too many tanks, ships, and planes to refurbish, and not enough capability to do it. Its army, however, might actually get a good deal more formidable in peacetime once Russia has enough time to properly train its new conscripts. Then there's the question of defensibility on the European continent. A Russian invasion will likely come by land first and foremost, and would likely be geographically constrained. After all, even if Russian heavy bombers can reach, say, Paris, they can't actually get there without being shot down 10 times over. Instead, a war will be fought wherever Russia can march its troops and support them with their artillery and air power. In some places, that's a tough ask for Russia. Its longest single border with a NATO nation is in Finland, where battle is tough. The Finns have historically proven to be tougher, and NATO would have time to respond to large-scale Russian mobilization in that area by beefing up their own defenses. The Baltics, as those nations already know, are far more vulnerable. But there's only so much Balkans to take before Russia is squeezed down toward Poland and forced to attack through Belarus or modern-day Ukraine. There, it runs into a nation on track to be Europe's newest military powerhouse, Poland, a place where NATO troops could likely meet Russia at much greater scale. So, Russia can make progress into Europe, but it can't just steamroll through the whole continent. Plus, Russia as an attacking force would find itself at an immediate disadvantage, fighting on terrain that its adversary knows well and would have time to prepare. Tougher for NATO to overcome are the difficulties inherent in moving its warfighting equipment toward the front. To do that, NATO needs logistical capability, and although it's got a not insignificant airlift capability, that capability just isn't enough to get everybody to the front in time unless America is helping. NATO does have frontline troops in proximity to the Russian border already, but they aren't in nearly great enough numbers to stop an all-out Russian attack by themselves. Vast numbers of NATO kit can get to the front lines. Continental initiatives like the 10T network have seen to it that road and rail corridors have been expanded. But although they can get there, they can't get there fast, meaning that unless NATO can track a Russian buildup and start to respond well in advance, it will lack the necessary prep time to position enough of a frontline force to be able to stonewall a Russian advance. Without that, it's likely a steady diet of tactical retreats until the cavalry arrives. Other potential issues for NATO come in the form of Turkey and Hungary, with Hungary in particular openly more preferential toward Russia than the rest of the alliance. Now look, Hungary's armed forces not exactly going to be taking over the continent in such a scenario, but they can certainly cause problems both geopolitically at alliance headquarters and strategically as a potential armed disruptor. Turkey has its own complex relationship with Russia, and although it's not as likely to go rogue, it's not terribly likely to show up. If Turkey doesn't come through, though, then NATO's troop count will drop rapidly and the Black Sea theatre is probably lost. Conversely, Russia can't really expect much benefit from either its own exclave Kaliningrad or its vassal state Belarus. Neither has the military capacity to truly make a difference, except in Belarus's case to provide Russia with a staging area for its own forces. Now, of course, we could discuss Russian assistance from North Korea or even China, but then we would open a Pandora's box and have to consider a wide range of other world nations entering the conflict, so let's leave that for another day. And then there's the outside-the-box possibility that's worth considering. How far could NATO nations get by taking the fight to Russia? Most thinking around a Russian invasion generally involves Russia pounding the living hell out of Eastern Europe, and certainly that would be Russia's approach. But could NATO actually turn the tables? One element we haven't touched on yet are the abundance of special operators in range of NATO nations, particularly Special Forces troops who are often quite experienced. Combine those troops, expert at fighting behind enemy lines with the capacity to launch long-range conventional missiles, and NATO's likely advantage in the air war and conventional counterattacks against Russia, especially in the regions around St. Petersburg on the Baltic coast, may become feasible. And finally, and perhaps most important of all the intangibles, is the difference in pain tolerance between the two sides. And this is one of the areas where the status of the Russian leadership, an authoritarian institution that engages in basically one-party rule, really comes in handy. Because as we've seen in Ukraine, Russia can stretch itself every which way to squeeze all the wartime advantages it can. It can conscript en masse, it can shift its entire economy into a war posture, it can afford to create and throw troops into battlefield meat grinders, and more. The nations of NATO have much less latitude for such things, partially because every nation in the alliance ultimately has to make its own choices, and partially because their citizens are simply less easy to force into enduring those sorts of extreme overreaches. That, of course, can change quickly. History abounds with examples of populations that rapidly become willing to endure hardship when faced with a more threatening adversary than they'd initially understood. But at least for now, it's Russia with the greatest capacity to grit its teeth and bear the costs of war. So as we come to the end of today's episode, it's time to step back and look at the situation in full. We've traded lots of advantages back and forth between Russia and the non-US nations of NATO, air and naval advantages to NATO, defense industrial advantages and grinding warfare style to Russia, and a whole lot of intangible factors flying in opposite directions. But on balance, when you take a really broad view and factor in military capabilities, current defense industrial capacity, geography, alliances, and the potential of each side to surge and improve its capabilities, NATO gets the better of this exchange even without the United States. But there's a reason why we saved the question of pain tolerance for last. NATO is strong enough in a broad enough range of areas to be able to win this war. But it is not strong enough to stop a war from being really, really, really painful for as long as it goes on. If Russia and Ukraine were to establish a permanent peace, Russia and NATO were to take 3 to 5 years, and then the two sides went to war, I could probably slow down Russia and get a Ukraine-style attritional fight somewhere on Polish soil and somewhere in the Scandinavian interior. And after shifting all of its attention to a total war, it would probably be able to either beat Russia in an air war and take out its prized attritional fighting tools that way, or even force its own defense industrial base to rival and then eclipse Russian production in the areas Russia values most. But to get there would be an incredibly painful process, one in which millions of people would be displaced, hundreds of thousands would lose their lives or be permanently disabled, and the entire continental order within Europe would have to endure complete and total upheaval. As for what you can make of such an ordeal, well, there are two ways to look at it. On one side, that's the price you pay to keep a continent safe from a power-hungry rival, and that's why the NATO alliance was built in the first place. On the other, it's a hell of a lot of blood to shed on a continent where large-scale bloodshed has been regarded mostly as a relic of history. Can NATO beat Russia without the United States? Probably, but the continent will have to walk through fire to make that happen, and every second that Europe wastes now, when it could have been preparing, it'll have to pay back in blood, in bullets, and in human lives when Moscow comes to collect. Thank you for watching.